I never thought betrayal could creep into the quiet corners of an ordinary life, but it did, seeping in like a slow poison. It wasn't just the betrayal itself that shattered me. It was the people behind it, the ones I trusted most, the ones I called family. I had built a life thinking I understood love, loyalty, and friendship. Turns out I didn't know anything at all. But before everything unraveled, before the chaos and revenge, there was a time when I believed my life was perfect. Back then, I was just a guy living in a quiet neighborhood, surrounded by good friends and a wife I adored. Sunday morning runs, backyard barbecues, and late-night football games were the pillars of our lives. We were a tight-knit group, 4 couples who knew everything about each other, or so we thought. But underneath the surface, secrets festered, relationships strained, and trust eroded without us even realizing it. If someone had told me how everything would fall apart, I would have laughed. But here I am, telling you how it did. Morning light barely touched the room when I woke, feeling an uneasy dread about the day ahead. I told myself nothing could truly hurt me today. But if things didn't go our way, it could ruin everything. As I moved to get up, she stirred beside me, pulling my hand back to rest on her pregnant belly. To her, nothing else mattered. Not the people waiting, not the law, not society. Just us and the baby. We stayed like that a little longer, savoring the calm before we faced the inevitable. Later, after showering together and sharing breakfast, she gently squeezed my hand. She wondered if we really had to go through with this. What we had was enough, she said, more than she ever hoped for. I nodded, but reminded her that we still had to try. As I went to bring the car around, I thought about how I might be the worst person alive. But I was happy. I wouldn't trade my life for anything. Let me explain. I'm divorced now, but that morning, I was having breakfast with the pregnant wife of my former best friend. We ran off together about 18 months ago, and the child she's carrying is mine. When we left, she wasn't pregnant, and I wasn't fully divorced. Her husband, Jay, would probably take her back in a heartbeat. Even after we left, I think he still loved her. Jay's in a wheelchair, paralyzed from the waist down, and he always spoke about her like she was his everything. I guess he thought they'd grow old together. Today, Aubrey and I are going to see him, to finally face the music. It's the last confrontation we need. Both our families have come to terms with our relationship over the past year and a half. Her parents even grew to respect me, though they'd prefer if we were married. My parents adored her from day one. I know what you're thinking, that I'm a homewrecker, the guy who'd steal your wife. Maybe you're picturing me as the reason your marriage fell apart. I wouldn't blame you, but before you judge me, hear me out. There's more to this story. My name is Barry Allen. A few years ago, my wife Iris and I moved into a quiet cul-de-sac, the kind of neighborhood where everyone knows everyone. 4 houses, 4 couples, we fit right in. Jay Garrick and his wife Aubrey lived next door. Jay was older, in his 40s, a bit overweight but full of charm. He had a reputation as a reformed womanizer, but he claimed meeting Aubrey changed everything. She was the one, he said. Then there was Wally West, a short, chubby accountant with thick glasses, and his wife Deborah, a dedicated schoolteacher. The last couple, Bart and Christy Allen, no relation, both worked in sales and had 2 kids the whole neighborhood adored. Life was good. We hosted parties, shared meals, and became more like family than neighbors. But about a year after moving in, things shifted. Jay remained my closest friend, but Aubrey grew distant and cold. It became a running topic among the guys. Jay confided in me about their fading intimacy and her emotional withdrawal. For a man like Jay, who thrived on connection, it was devastating. One Sunday, while watching football at my place, I had the biggest TV, we tried to figure out what was going on with Aubrey. Maybe we'd offended her somehow. Jay didn't think so. Wally suggested hormonal issues, but she was too young for that. Bart finally said what we were all thinking. Maybe Aubrey was having an affair. Jay's face fell at the idea, but we promised to support him. Jay and I hired a private detective. For 2 months, Aubrey was under constant surveillance. The result? Nothing. She never left the house without Jay and never had visitors unless he was home. She seemed utterly isolated. With no signs of infidelity and hormones ruled out, we concluded that Aubrey was just difficult. Jay was relieved she wasn't cheating, but the mystery remained. Looking back, Jay probably should have just asked Aubrey what was wrong, but none of us thought to do that. We were too caught up in our own lives. Wally and Bart with their bowling league, Jay with golf and racing, and me with my Mustang and running. I was 26 then, in great shape from working out and running regularly. My wife Iris was my opposite in many ways. Short, a bit overweight, but with a warm, loving heart. I fell for her in college and never cared about her size. Her curves were part of what I loved. We had a passionate relationship, sneaking off to avoid public indecency. Back then, I believed two things were unchangeable. My Mustang could outrun any car in town, and Iris loved me with all her heart. She always said nothing could separate us but death. And even then, only when we were both gone. I believed her. I believed in us. But clearly, we were both wrong. And that's how I ended up here, telling you this story. It was a typical autumn Sunday, the kind I usually spent on a long run. That morning, I told Iris I'd be out for 20 miles, part of my marathon training routine. But I wasn't feeling it, so I cut the run short at 10 miles and headed home. As I walked down our street, I saw Aubrey in her yard. I waved, but she ignored me as usual. I figured she saw me and was just being her typical cold self. I always felt bad for Jay, wondering how a decent guy like him ended up with someone so bitter. I'd always tried to be polite to her, hoping she'd eventually warm up, like when we first moved in. Approaching my house, I noticed the curtains were open. Iris often reminded me to close them, but I must have forgotten. Not that it mattered. They were too busy to notice. Inside, I saw Iris and my best friend Jay having closeness. Bart stood nearby, apparently waiting his turn. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Before I could react, Aubrey appeared behind me. She thought I was part of it, assuming I knew about everything. When she realized I didn't, her entire demeanor changed. She apologized, explaining she thought I was involved because everyone else seemed to be. Bart, Wally, even Christy, who was apparently into partner swapping with Bart. I couldn't stay there. I headed to the garage, grabbed my spare car keys, and started the Mustang. Aubrey followed me, and for reasons I still don't fully understand, I let her in the car. We sped off just as Iris stumbled out of the house, realizing I'd seen everything. For a while, we drove in silence. Aubrey eventually explained that she had discovered the same betrayal a year earlier. She'd been convinced I was part of it, just like the rest. Both of us had been living in the dark, surrounded by people we trusted, only to be blindsided. Eventually, the weight of everything caught up to me. I pulled off the highway, grabbed some breakfast, and we sat at a park, watching kids play while trying to process what had happened. Aubrey admitted that all she ever wanted was a simple life, a loving husband, a family, stability. She thought she had it with Jay until she found out the truth. I shared how I felt the same about Iris. We both realized we'd been living lies, clinging to people who had betrayed us. It became clear why Aubrey had been so distant over the past year. She had been carrying the weight of this secret alone, just as I was now. Neither of us had planned for this, but somehow we found an odd comfort in knowing we weren't alone anymore. It all felt like a bad joke. Aubrey confessed how hard she had tried to make things work with Jay, only to be betrayed by him indulging in things she found degrading. She loved him, would have done anything for him, but he never gave her a chance. She admitted she even considered compromising her own values to keep him happy, but it wouldn't have mattered. Jay had found what he wanted with Iris, and their relationship had only grown more twisted over time. In retaliation, Aubrey stopped being intimate with Jay, but it seemed like the only person she truly hurt was herself. She felt more isolated and angry with every passing day. She called herself a naive country girl, saying she genuinely believed Jay's promises when he swore he'd left his cheating days behind. I could relate all too well. I met Iris in college while I was training for the Olympics. Focused on improving my performance, I mingled with athletes from other sports thinking their skills could help my own. That's how I met Iris, through mutual friends on the football team. Iris didn't stand out the way some of the other girls did. She wasn't traditionally beautiful, but there was something about her that felt different. One of my friends warned me about her, claiming she had a reputation for getting too close to the guys on the team, and suggested I find a good girl. I listened at first. Dated other women who were slimmer, more popular, even more conventionally attractive. But none of them made me feel the way Iris did. I ran into her again just before graduation. She worked at the library where I was studying. She reintroduced herself, though I hadn't forgotten her. We talked until the library closed, grabbed coffee, and exchanged numbers. Despite my hesitation, I called her the next day. That call turned into an hour-long conversation, and soon we were dating. Iris struggled with her body image. She told me she was starving herself to lose weight, thinking that was the only way a guy like me would be interested. I reassured her that she didn't need to change a thing, but the deeper we got into our relationship, the more I realized she carried emotional baggage from how others had treated her in the past. She'd been used, taken advantage of, and felt like she had to settle for scraps of affection. Eventually, we graduated, met each other's families, got engaged, and married. Life felt normal. We moved into the neighborhood, made friends, and for a while, everything seemed fine. But now, everything was unraveling. Aubrey admitted she stayed with Jay out of spite, hoping he'd realize his mistakes and come back to her. But he had Iris now, and Aubrey was left feeling hollow. I, on the other hand, was drowning in anger and betrayal. Revenge felt inevitable, but I needed to figure out how to make it count. A simple punch wouldn't be enough. We drove back home in silence, the crisp autumn air doing little to cool the fire in my chest. When we pulled into the neighborhood, everyone seemed to be watching. Bart and Christy whispered on their porch. Wally and Deborah lingered outside, pretending not to stare. As I parked the car, I saw Jay waiting on my porch. I pulled into the garage and Aubrey gave me a tight hug before walking off. Jay's eyes narrowed when he saw us, but I didn't care. Iris appeared at the back door as the garage closed, but I ignored her and focused on Jay. "Barry, I'm sorry, man," Jay started. "We need to talk about this like adults, figure out how to fix it." But I didn't want to talk. I hit him square in the face. Wally looked horrified. Iris gasped, and Jay fell to the ground, clutching his jaw. "Barry," Jay groaned. "I hope you feel better, but we still need to talk." As I turned to head inside, Aubrey's voice floated over the fence, mocking him. "Jay, are we out of tanning oil?" Wally trailed behind me, begging me not to tell Deborah about his involvement. I ignored him, went inside, and turned on the TV. The pre-game NFL chatter buzzed in the background, but I wasn't paying attention. My mind was already working through how I'd get back at all of them. Revenge wasn't just a possibility, it was inevitable. Iris walked into the room, trying to talk about what happened. I cut her off, furious, and told her to leave before I lost control. She got the message and walked out without another word. Half an hour later, the doorbell rang. Iris answered, and soon after, Bart barged in carrying pizza like nothing had happened. He tried to act casual, asking where everyone was since it was almost game time. I snapped, warning him to get out, but instead of leaving, he tried to smooth things over, claiming what happened didn't mean anything, and offering to even the score by suggesting I spend time with Christy. He reminded me they had an open marriage and figured that would make things right. I told him to get out and never come near me again. As he left, he made some snide comment about me finding someone else. I turned to see Aubrey standing in the doorway, holding a plate of cookies and smiling. She'd come to watch football, mentioning that Jay was nursing a swollen lip in the bathroom after our earlier confrontation. Aubrey sat down next to me, and we settled in to watch the game. When I asked if she wanted something to drink, she joked about wanting milk with cookies, but I knew she'd prefer beer for football. I went to get our drinks, and when I came back, Iris was in the room again, trying to talk to Aubrey, who completely ignored her. I focused on the game, explaining to Aubrey why I was a die-hard Detroit Lions fan despite living in California. I made sure to emphasize loyalty, shooting a pointed look at Iris. She tried to butt in, but I shut her down every time, making it clear she wasn't welcome. Aubrey and I watched the game, relaxed and enjoyed ourselves while Iris stewed in the background. The Lions won, and for the first time in a long while, I had fun. After the game, Aubrey grabbed the remote and picked a movie, Drive Angry with Nicolas Cage. It turned out to be surprisingly good. As we ran low on cookies and drinks, I went to the kitchen to grab more. That's when I saw Iris and her little crew, Jay, Bart, and Wally, gathered in the living room, probably plotting their next move. Iris tried to talk to me again, hinting at reconciliation and pretending her betrayal was just a minor mistake. I wasn't having it. I told her and the others to get out of my house, threatening consequences if they didn't. Then I went back to the couch, sat next to Aubrey, and continued the movie like nothing had happened. After the movie, I walked Aubrey home. As we passed Jay, Wally, and Bart, Aubrey hugged me tightly. Jay, seething, warned me to stay away from his wife, trying to justify his actions by claiming Iris came onto him. I wasn't buying it. I reminded him that if he thought that made it okay, then the same logic applied to me and Aubrey. She deserved a friend, and I intended to be one. I made it clear that he was the reason everything had fallen apart. If he hadn't crossed the line with Iris, none of this would have happened. Jay looked down, defeated. Wally tried to shift the blame, saying Jay dragged him into it, but I wasn't having that either. I warned him that Deborah would eventually find out, and when she did, their marriage would be over. Jay tried to suggest this was all turning into some kind of wife-swapping arrangement, but I shut that down immediately. Until that morning, I loved my wife more than anything and would have never agreed to something like that. But now, everything had changed. Jay ruined my marriage, and it was only fair he suffered too. Bart chimed in with his usual nonsense about open relationships, claiming this was just an experiment gone wrong. He suggested we all make up, pretend none of it happened, and move on. I told him that his marriage wasn't even real. It was more like a business partnership. Offering Christy to me to save his own skin was pathetic. Until today, I thought of these guys as brothers. But now I'd lost 4 of the most important people in my life in one shot. I made it clear I was done with all of them. No more talking, no more apologies. They destroyed my marriage, and there was no coming back from that. If I ever saw any of them near my house again, there'd be consequences, and I wouldn't hesitate. As I turned toward the house, I saw Iris standing there, clearly eavesdropping. The moment I stepped inside, she followed me, tears brimming in her eyes. She insisted she deserved a chance to talk, just like the others. I sat on the steps, agreeing that it was better to get this over with before lawyers got involved. Iris didn't try to sugarcoat her actions. She admitted she was wrong, claimed it was just closeness and fun, and confessed she never thought I'd find out. She reminded me I knew the kind of woman she was when we met, that she'd embellished her past but never really hid it. She argued that this was the first time she cheated in our 6-year relationship and believed she deserved another chance. She then shifted into a sob story about her struggles growing up as the chubby girl who had to work hard to get attention. She confessed to hanging around the football dorms in college where guys used her for love whenever it was convenient. Sometimes multiple guys at once. She said she didn't dream of becoming that kind of woman. It just happened. When we met, she claimed, I made her want to be better. But after we moved to this neighborhood, things changed. Surrounded by only 4 couples, she felt like the least attractive woman in the group. She wanted to be noticed, and Jay, being the liar and womanizer he was, started flirting with her. She flirted back, letting him sneak glances. One day, when I wasn't home, he showed up, got her drunk, and they slept together. After that, Aubrey stopped talking to both of them, and things spiraled. Wally, Bart, they all got involved, using her to fulfill their fantasies. For Iris, it felt like reliving her college days while still having the security of my love at home. She claimed that until recently, she didn't believe she could have it both ways, but the past year proved otherwise. She argued that nothing changed until I found out, that I still loved her before this morning. Now, the way I looked at her hurt her more than anything else. She wanted me to think it over, promising to put me first, but admitting she liked the attention from other men. She suggested we could explore it together, but said she'd stop if I insisted. She didn't want a divorce. She wanted us to grow old together. I told her I didn't care what she wanted. I couldn't even look at her without feeling sick. Our marriage was beyond saving. She could do whatever she wanted, but I'd never touch her again. Desperate, she begged for another chance, offering to go to counseling. That idea sparked something in me. Counseling would buy me time to put my own plans into motion. I agreed, but made it clear we weren't sharing a bed until I was sure things could be fixed, which I knew they wouldn't be. The next morning, I woke up alone in bed. For a moment, I missed her, but quickly reminded myself why she wasn't there. I got dressed and went downstairs. Iris was in the kitchen, wearing one of my favorite nightgowns, conveniently unbuttoned to show off her chest. She moved around like she hadn't noticed me, but I saw right through it. Her actions were manipulative, and it was clear she wasn't the woman I thought I'd married. Maybe she never was. Maybe I was just too blind to see it. I chuckled to myself, realizing how naive I'd been. Iris turned and asked what was so funny, pretending nothing was wrong. I told her it wasn't anything she did, though it was hard not to think about what I'd seen the day before. She flinched at my words, but kept trying to engage me. She asked if I wanted breakfast or to talk, but I brushed her off. I wasn't hungry, and I wasn't interested in rehashing the same painful conversation. She insisted she'd thought things over during the night and had more to say. Standing in front of me, she let her cleavage do the talking, but I wasn't buying it. I smiled, walked around her, grabbed my briefcase, and left without looking back. As soon as I walked in, Iris was right behind me, desperate to talk. She insisted that if we didn't communicate, we couldn't fix things. But I wasn't sure I even wanted to fix anything. I told her I wasn't going to be the version of me she had imagined, and she needed to stop thinking she could predict or manipulate my reactions. She claimed she wasn't trying to manipulate me only to make amends. She reminded me that beyond being married, we'd been best friends, and she was realizing just how much she'd hurt me. She wanted to set things right and move forward. I set my briefcase down, clapped sarcastically, and told her it was a nice speech, clearly rehearsed. But this wasn't something that could just be patched up. It might take weeks, months, or maybe I'd just come home with divorce papers. To me, what we had felt unique, magical even. Now, I realized I was just another name on her list, the only fool dumb enough to believe she was special. She tried to interrupt, but I cut her off. She'd torn my heart out, and now I had to relearn everything I thought I knew about my life. It felt like starting from scratch, like the woman I loved had died and left behind someone I didn't recognize and didn't want. Iris slumped into a chair, but I wasn't done. I told her this wasn't just a minor mistake, like a foul in a football game. She hadn't just broken a rule. She'd annulled the very foundation of our marriage. The reasons we got married were clearly not what I thought they were, and maybe they never were. So why were we even together? She tried to stay composed, insisting that nothing had changed, and she still loved me. She wanted me to believe it was just a slip-up, a moment of weakness. But I told her point blank. When we married, we made vows. If those vows didn't mean anything to her, why had she bothered? I told her to find a therapist, fast. If she didn't, there'd be nothing left to salvage. Then I left for work. The day passed uneventfully, but my mind wasn't on the job. While sorting through some files, I stumbled across the contact info of an attorney I'd worked with before. He represented a powerful businessman who recently made headlines after a deal collapsed. I had an idea and asked the lawyer to arrange a meeting, hoping his boss remembered me well enough to agree. I also booked an appointment with one of the toughest divorce lawyers in the area, someone with a reputation for tearing through cases without mercy. By the end of the day, I didn't even want to go home. There was nothing waiting for me there. I thought about hitting a bar with some coworkers, but decided I'd save that for another day. I'd need to start building new friendships soon, but there was time for that. When I finally pulled into the driveway, I sat in the car for a while, dreading going inside. Eventually, I went in quietly, dropped my briefcase, and collapsed on the couch. I closed my eyes, trying to relax, maybe even drift off. Then I felt her hands on my shoulders, massaging gently. For a split second, it felt good, until reality snapped back. I told her coldly to get her hands off me. I stood up abruptly, seeing the pain flash across her face. She said she was just trying to make me feel better after a hard day, but I told her work wasn't the problem. Coming home to her was. She asked about dinner, unsure if I wanted to eat before or after my run. I told her to do whatever she wanted, just like she had in our marriage. I went upstairs, changed into my running gear, and headed outside. Iris watched me as I left, quietly telling me to be careful. I ignored her. As I stepped onto the porch, Aubrey appeared with a smile, saying today's run was going to be awful. I agreed, explaining that Mondays were my recovery days, slow, easy jogs after long Sunday runs. But she wasn't talking about that. She said it'd be worse because she was coming with me. We started running at a snail's pace. Jay was standing in his doorway watching us, and I could feel the neighbor's eyes following as we jogged by. It was painfully slow, but Aubrey's smile made it tolerable. After a block, she slowed to a walk and grabbed my hand, joking that running was harder than her aerobics videos. I just smiled and nodded, feeling the tension ease slightly. She mentioned that Jay wanted to talk to me again, thinking I'd cooled off by now. But Bart had convinced him to wait, reminding him of my threat if any of them showed up at my house again. Aubrey smiled, still holding my hand, and asked if I really had a tool. I told her it was my father's, a rare .45 from his Army intelligence days, powerful enough to make anything it hit explode. She was intrigued, saying her dad knew a lot about tools but had never mentioned anything like that. I told her to ask him. I was sure he'd heard of it. For the first time in days, I felt a flicker of something other than anger. Maybe it wasn't happiness, but it was a start. As we strolled through the park, Aubrey clung to my hand, reluctant to let go. Eventually, she pulled me toward a bench, stretching her legs out as we sat. I noticed a jogger crash into a pole, distracted by her, but kept the laugh to myself. She casually mentioned Jay had warned her to stay away from me, clearly amused by how well that worked out. I smiled, but got straight to the point. I needed to know what she wanted from all this. I had a plan, but I didn't want her getting caught up in something that might hurt her even more. Aubrey didn't hold back. She said she despised Jay, not enough to wish him dead, but enough to want him out of her life. Divorce was on her mind, but it wasn't simple. Jay had destroyed her dreams, and she wanted revenge. But practically speaking, she wouldn't get a cent out of the divorce. She'd likely have to move back in with her parents and return to waitressing, but even that was better than staying trapped with him. I reminded her that in most divorces she'd be entitled to half the assets, but Aubrey laughed, explaining Jay's financial reality. He was all show, no substance. The Camaro he flaunted was leased, their mortgage was barely manageable, and if he missed a single paycheck, they'd be in serious trouble. Neither of them had enough money to come out ahead. She had nothing to lose. I shared my plan with her and she burst out laughing, adding a few clever twists of her own. We shook on it, knowing this would be the end of our little suburban community. But beyond revenge, there was something else growing between us, a closeness that neither of us expected. On the way back, Christy popped out, wearing her usual fake sweet smile. She teased us about our run and reminded me about Bart's offer from the day before, hinting that I could take her up on it any time. Aubrey stayed silent until Christy walked away. When I explained Bart and Christy's ridiculous proposal, Aubrey's eyes narrowed, shooting a glare at Christy's back. I quickly changed the subject, asking if she was hungry. She nodded eagerly, and I suggested we both freshen up and have a steak dinner on my balcony. Her smile came back, and she headed inside. I rushed into my house, bounding up the stairs to the shower. By the time I came back down, Iris was standing there, noticing my better mood. She tried to engage, but I brushed past her, heading out to the garden to get the steaks. As I rummaged through the freezer, Iris followed, saying she'd already made pasta, something she claimed I loved after a long run. I told her I'd been thinking about her suggestion from the day before, that she should explore her affairs as much as she wanted. She looked surprised, but tried to downplay it, saying she wanted to focus on fixing our marriage. I insisted she should really dive into it, test her limits. It might even help her figure out what she truly wanted. For a second, her face lit up, thinking I meant we'd explore this together. But I shut that down quickly. I had no desire to be anywhere near her, let alone watch her with someone else. That hit her hard. She snapped, accusing me of giving her permission just so I could be with Aubrey. She claimed Jay was right to be scared, convinced I'd fall for Aubrey if given the chance. She insisted she wasn't interested in any more affairs. It had cost her too much already. I laughed, shaking my head. She tried to argue that everything she did was just about love, nothing emotional. She claimed none of the guys wanted anything serious, and neither did she. It was just fun, she said, and now it was over. She wanted to focus on us. I asked if she thought I'd had any fun in all of this. She didn't respond. When she saw me pulling out 2 steaks, she asked if I wanted her to join me for dinner. I told her one was for Aubrey. Her face twisted in anger. She hissed that I shouldn't spend time with Aubrey, warning that we were too emotional and would end up falling in love. She claimed Aubrey wasn't even my type. I shot back, telling her I didn't have a type. I loved Iris because I thought I knew her. It wasn't about her body or her looks. It was about who I believed she was. But that woman didn't exist anymore. I loved the person I thought she was, not the liar standing in front of me. She asked why I kept speaking in the past tense. I told her a part of me died the day I found out about her betrayal. Every time I looked at her now, all I saw was the cheating, the lies. I wasn't sure I could ever move past that. She started crying, saying I had to find a way to forgive her. But I told her life goes on, with or without us being together. Sometimes people can be hurt so deeply that there's no coming back. I pointed out how Aubrey had suffered for a whole year, hoping Jay would change, but he didn't. Eventually, all the love she had for him just disappeared. Iris mentioned that Jay still loved Aubrey, terrified that we'd end up together. She reminded me of all the things Jay said the night before, about how unfair it was if we swapped partners, how he thought Aubrey was too good to lose. But I made it clear to Iris that she and Jay didn't understand. Aubrey and I never had a choice in any of this. No one asked us if we wanted to be part of their sick little game. Now, they regretted their choices, but it was too late. They made their bed. They could lie in it. Iris sat at the kitchen table, finally silent, absorbing everything I said. I heard footsteps on the back porch and turned to her one last time. "Iris," I said softly, watching her tear-streaked face lift to meet mine. "Are you still having fun?" I stepped outside to find Aubrey waiting. We grilled our steaks, laughing and talking like none of the chaos around us existed. But we knew Jay and Iris were watching from their windows, their bitterness palpable. At one point, Debbie even showed up, wanting to talk. It quickly became clear she had no idea about any of the affairs, and we decided to keep her in the dark. For now. The rest of the week followed a similar pattern. I finally got back to running while Aubrey borrowed Debbie's bike, riding alongside me. Sometimes I slowed down just to keep pace with her, watching her as she pedaled ahead. I had to admit there was something mesmerizing about her, something I hadn't felt in a long time. By Friday, Aubrey and I were ready to set our plan into motion. I told Iris we'd have a meeting on Sunday, and she passed the message along to the others. Sunday morning, after the Lions game, I went for a long 22-mile run. The miles helped clear my head, but I couldn't shake the thought of Aubrey. I missed her more than I wanted to admit. When I got back home, Iris had made something to eat, but I ignored her as usual. My legs were cramping with every step, so I showered and stretched out. Some coworkers arrived soon after, and I ordered pizza while giving them a quick tour of the living room. As the delivery guy pulled up, I saw Jay and Wally sitting on Jay's porch, looking hopeful. They assumed everything was back to normal when they spotted the 3 large pizzas. I gave them a polite nod and turned back inside, letting them stew in their false sense of security. Just before kickoff, the doorbell rang. Jay, Wally, and Bart stood on my porch, clearly oblivious to the cars parked in my driveway. I told them they were early and the meeting wasn't until after the game. That's when Aubrey appeared, stepping onto the porch in a skin-tight tank top and barely there shorts. She carried a plate of cookies, breezing past me into the house. Wally and Bart stared, practically drooling, while Jay looked like he'd swallowed a grenade. "See you guys after the game," I said, shutting the door with a smirk. Inside, Derek from work poked his head out of the living room, confused. "Barry, there's a woman in your chair, and it's not your wife. The guys and I are curious." I told him to be polite. Aubrey was my friend, and she was watching the game with us. Derek shook his head, muttering about how they were supposed to focus on the TV with her in the room. I knew Jay would be fuming after hearing that. Throughout the game, my coworkers cheered, ate pizza, but most of their attention was on Aubrey. They couldn't stop asking who she was and how I knew her. A few knew about my marriage troubles, but none of them were prepared for the reality of Aubrey. She seemed to love every second of it. After the game, we cranked up the music, and soon enough, people were dancing. I'm no dancer, but Aubrey and I drew plenty of attention. She turned down every guy who asked her to dance, telling them I got jealous and didn't like sharing. The playful possessiveness wasn't just an act, it felt real. Later, in the car, things got heated. I asked if she was ready, meaning for the meeting, but she misread my question. She joked about finding a place to hook up, even suggesting the back seat, though we both knew that wasn't going to happen. I laughed and clarified I meant tomorrow's showdown with Jay and the others. She laughed too, but there was an edge to it. The games would be over soon. She mentioned how furious Debbie was with Wally, wishing we could deal with him first. I told her I'd rather deal with Iris to ease my own pain. I checked the cameras. Iris had been with Jay again just the day before. Aubrey dismissed it, saying she was over Jay's pathetic attempts to reel her back in. We had bigger things to worry about, ourselves. She ran her hand over me, insisting she wasn't as special as I thought. Just an ordinary girl who wanted to be with me once this mess was over. She even joked about claiming me before Christy tried to make a move. When we pulled into the driveway, Aubrey casually mentioned she wasn't wearing any underwear. I laughed, but it was hard to shake the tension between us. As we got out, all the neighbors' eyes were on us, as usual. I hugged her, planning just a quick kiss, but she had other ideas. She pulled me in deeper, right as Jay opened his front door. We barely noticed him. Something had shifted between Aubrey and me. A line had been crossed, and I wasn't sure I could go back. But somehow, I managed to leave her that night, even though everything inside me wanted to stay. Inside, I found Iris sitting at the kitchen table, fuming. She asked if Aubrey was better in bed, claiming Jay had said she was boring. Iris argued she wasn't as pretty, but she was better at closeness, offering to do anything I wanted if I gave her another chance. I asked why, if Aubrey was so boring, Jay was desperate to get her back. Iris snapped that he loved Aubrey, just like she supposedly loved me. I called her out, asking why she'd been with Jay again the day before if she was so in love with me. Her face went pale. I told her I had cameras in both houses. She started to protest, but I cut her off. Aubrey and I had been giving them chances, but they'd blown it. Now they could live with the consequences. I left Iris crying at the table. The next morning, I woke to the sound of hammering. Looking out the window, I saw Jay struggling to put up Christmas decorations, with Aubrey directing him from below. He was trying to hoist an inflatable Santa onto the roof, his movements awkward and tense. As I stepped outside for my run, I waved to Aubrey. She blew me a kiss. Jay smiled and waved too, clueless. "Running away with me?" I joked. Iris appeared on our porch looking like hell. Aubrey's smile faltered. She said last night had been magical, but needed time to think. She was going back to Jay. I wished her happiness and took off on my run. As I passed Jay's house, I saw Bart and Christy heading inside with their kids, followed by Wally and Deb. Deb waved and I returned the gesture, ignoring Wally completely. The neighborhood had become a stage for betrayal, but the final act was just beginning. As I rounded the corner, I stopped running and quietly slipped into Wally's garage. Aubrey and I had planned everything. She'd ordered chemical accelerants online using Wally's credit card with Deb's help. We even stashed some in the trunk of Wally's car. I quickly coated the deck around his BBQ, the awning, and the side of his house with the chemicals. They dry in about 30 minutes, just enough time for Aubrey to keep everyone distracted. After my run, I got home to see Aubrey and Jay on their porch, deep in conversation. Jay smugly announced they'd patched things up. I shot him a glare and went inside for a shower. As I was getting dressed, Iris barged into my room, rambling about how Aubrey had forgiven Jay and promised to sleep with him if he followed her orders. She saw this as a sign that we could fix things too. I laughed in her face, reminding her that she'd promised me the same weeks ago, right before jumping back into bed with Jay. I told her divorce was on the horizon, but I'd be fair. Iris looked nervous, probably thinking I was about to walk out. She asked where I was going, and I lied, claiming there was an issue with one of our trucks at work. As I left, I saw her heading towards Jay, only for him to shut her down cold. Aubrey didn't even glance at me as she climbed into Jay's truck, and they drove off. I hit the road too, heading into town to pick up a mobile generator truck from work. These trucks looked like regular Ford F-150s, but had powerful commercial generators mounted on the back. My buddy at the warehouse didn't ask questions when I told him it was for a Christmas show. No paperwork, no trail. I owed him one. While I was out, I called my business partner to let him know our new venture was close to launching. Mr. Reynolds' lawyer had contacted me weeks ago, and we'd arranged a meeting. Reynolds liked my idea and was ready to move forward if I could secure the necessary properties. Back home, I parked the generator truck behind my house, hidden from view. I jumped the fence into Jay's backyard. Aubrey had left the back door unlocked, so I slipped inside, headed upstairs, and stepped onto their back balcony. I climbed onto the roof, disabled one of the lights on their giant inflatable Santa, and attached 2 thick, exposed cables to it. I doused the area with water to ensure maximum effect. Then I retraced my steps, ran the cables to the generator, and waited. Soon enough, I heard Jay's truck pull into the driveway. He and Aubrey were arguing. Jay wanted to take her for a spin in his Camaro, but she insisted on using the truck. Then right there on the porch, she told him she loved me and was only married to him. Jay was livid. He stormed off, muttering about fixing the decorations. It struck me how tiny our neighborhood really was. The shouting drew everyone out of their homes. While Jay climbed the rickety stairs to the roof, I slipped to the back of my house, fired up the generator, and returned to sit on the porch. Inside, Iris was rambling about how I'd turned Aubrey down the night before, insisting it was because I still loved her. I cut her off, cold and direct, explaining that I wasn't about to screw up our divorce by sleeping with someone else. Outside, Jay was struggling with the decorations. I sat back, waiting. He finally reached the roof, grabbed Santa, and touched one of the exposed wires. Instantly, his body convulsed, sparks flew, and he toppled off the roof, hitting the ladder on his way down before landing awkwardly in front of Aubrey, Christy, and Debbie. The women screamed. Bart rushed over, yelling for me to call emergency. I nodded, slipped inside, and disconnected the generator before dialing emergency from my phone. By the time the ambulance arrived, Jay was still unconscious. I returned the generator truck to the warehouse, thinking how this wasn't the plan. Jay wasn't supposed to fall, just mess up the decorations so Aubrey could tear into him. But this was her part of the plan, and she hated him as much as I did. My goal had been to see him foreclose on his mortgage, not land in the hospital. A few hours later, Aubrey showed up at my door, fresh from the hospital. Jay had severe electrical burns and a broken back. Not what we'd planned, but she was satisfied. 1 down, 3 to go, she said with a smile. That's when I decided never to cross her. I needed to ask her something. Before I could, she smiled, already knowing. She admitted she'd nearly blown our plan, but didn't care. When she felt something, she said it, no matter who heard. She confessed she loved me. Life in the neighborhood took a turn. Iris started drinking and eating more than ever. Wally tiptoed around Deb, who acted like nothing was wrong while quietly moving her belongings out, ready to leave when the time was right. After Jay's accident, Deb suggested a barbecue to discuss how to help Jay and Aubrey. Wally, ever the BBQ enthusiast with the neighborhood's biggest, fanciest grill, was eager to host. I made it clear I didn't care about helping Jay, but was more than willing to support Aubrey. Iris scoffed. At the barbecue, Wally lit the grill, and within seconds, flames erupted, racing from the BBQ to the awning and into the house. Wally scrambled for the hose, but Deb had already turned off the water. Bart called the fire department, but by the time they arrived, the house was gone. Days later, the police arrested Wally for arson. Deb filed for divorce while he was in jail. Wally insisted he was framed, convinced Deb was punishing him for his affair with Iris. But the evidence was stacked against him. He pled guilty and got 35 years. Had he gone to trial, the sentence would have been even harsher. Ryan Reynolds, the developer, bought Wally's property. But the demolition crew made a mistake. They tore down Bart and Christie's house instead. When they returned, their home was nothing but rubble. Furious, Bart could only watch as the crew loaded debris into dump trucks. Aubrey, ever the gracious host, let them crash at her place until they figured out their next move. The neighborhood was falling apart, and every piece was right where we wanted it. Wally's misfortune continued to spiral. As their accountant, he'd let Bart and Christie's insurance lapse while they were switching policies. When their house was mistakenly demolished, Ryan Reynolds stepped in again, offering to buy the property at its current appraised value. Unfortunately, the housing market had tanked, leaving Bart and Christie with far less than they'd invested. 3 weeks after Jay's accident, Aubrey told me he wanted to see me. I finally agreed. He looked awful, frail, thin, and barely able to move his arms. His attempt at casual greetings felt forced, and when he asked Aubrey to leave us alone, she corrected him sharply, reminding him to use her name. She smiled as she shut the door, the kind of smile you give someone you despise. Jay admitted Aubrey was leaving him. I didn't have sympathy. It was his fault after all. But I asked what he wanted. He confessed he was behind on his mortgage and the bank was threatening foreclosure. I asked why he didn't just sell his Camaro, only to learn it had already been repossessed. That's when I noticed his legs weren't moving. Jay explained that his broken back had left him paralyzed from the waist down. He'd never walk again and would soon be on permanent disability, but even that wouldn't save his house or marriage. I left feeling conflicted. My thirst for revenge had driven me this far, but staring at Jay, broken and helpless, dulled that fire. Wally was rotting in prison, his career and reputation destroyed. Bart and Christie had lost their home, and their marriage was crumbling. And Jay, he'd lost everything, his mobility, his home, and soon his wife. But the one person who betrayed me most, Iris, still walked free, untouched by the chaos. Yet somehow, seeing Jay like that drained my anger. I didn't want to hurt anyone anymore. I just wanted peace. Outside Jay's room, Aubrey was waiting. She could sense something was off. I told her about Jay's condition, but she dismissed it with a cold smile. She admitted we might have gone too far, but it was hard to pity someone who'd lied and manipulated her. Jay had been her first love, pulled her away from her family, and broken every promise he made. She reminded me how I'd treated Iris like a queen, only for Iris to mock me behind my back, telling other women I was more like her butler than her husband. Aubrey's resentment had turned to hatred when she caught Jay with Iris. She confessed she'd fantasized about torturing them both. And now, seeing them suffer felt like justice, though she wondered if it was enough. I saw the rage simmering in her eyes. But I asked her the question we'd both been avoiding. What now? What happens when revenge runs out? She hesitated. For once, Aubrey didn't have an answer. So I joked, suggesting we find new people to take revenge on, my third-grade teacher maybe. But then I got serious. I pulled her close, kissed her, and told her it was time to let go. We'd won. There was no need to drag this out. We had each other, and that was enough. Aubrey smiled and agreed. As long as we faced the future together, she didn't care what we did next. Back home, I called Ryan Reynolds. I explained Jay's situation, and though it wasn't part of our original plan, Ryan saw potential in acquiring Jay's property. He invited me to his office to review preliminary plans. Meanwhile, Aubrey went home to check on her temporary guests, and I went to see Iris. I told Iris it was time we talked. She looked worn down, the stress and guilt written all over her face. I softened my approach, complimenting her beauty and intelligence, knowing it would ease the blow. I admitted the last few weeks had been hard on both of us, and that we couldn't keep living like this. Sometimes, I said, you just have to start over. She broke down in tears. For the first time in weeks, I reached out and held her hand. Then I stood, walked around the table, and hugged her. "You want a divorce, don't you?" she whispered. I nodded. Iris tried to convince me that counseling would fix everything, but I knew better. The damage she caused went deeper than therapy could ever reach. Trust had been shattered, and no amount of sessions could rebuild what was already dead. If anything, it was my love for her that made the betrayal unbearable. Had I loved her less, maybe I could have brushed it off like Jay or Bart would with their wives, but I didn't. I loved her fully, and that's exactly why I couldn't stay. Iris argued that Jay loved Aubrey, but she was wrong. Jay didn't love Aubrey. He possessed her. She was just another trophy, like his Camaro. And now, just like his car, she wasn't his anymore. I told Iris it was over. We'd split everything 50-50ths and try to stay civil, though even that felt like a stretch. She clung to hope, suggesting ridiculous things, ankle monitors, new locks, to keep herself in check. But that wasn't trust, that was imprisonment. We'd grow to resent each other even more. I tried to be gentle, giving her false hope about maybe being friends in the future. I wasn't being kind. I just knew people behave better in divorce when they think there's a sliver of a chance left. The truth was, I was done. Iris's betrayal had destroyed not just our marriage, but the entire neighborhood. Wally's house was gone. His marriage ended in divorce. Bart and Christy were on the verge of splitting. Jay would soon lose his home, and Aubrey was barely hanging on. Iris's selfishness had wrecked 4 marriages, 10 lives, including 2 kids. Seeing her face as she realized the extent of the destruction almost made me feel sorry for her. Almost. Later, I stopped by Aubrey's place. Christy was packing up her kids' clothes. They didn't have much left. Bart and Christy's marriage was falling apart, and their financial situation wasn't any better. They had just enough for a new house, but the cost of lawyers and splitting up meant they'd both need separate places. When Aubrey came downstairs, she looked tired, worn out. On the way to the hospital, she told me Jay was refusing to give her a divorce. He claimed they'd be together until death, twisting their wedding vows into a threat. I laughed, but Aubrey didn't. She was trapped in a nightmare, and I could see how much it was eating at her. I reassured her that Jay couldn't stop the divorce legally. He could only stall it. Worst case, she could just walk away. Life was too short for this kind of misery. At the hospital, I laid it out for Jay. The bank was coming for his house, and he needed $90,000 in 2 days to save it. His home wasn't even worth that much anymore thanks to the market crash. He was broke, paralyzed, and on the verge of homelessness. But I'd found a buyer, someone willing to cover the mortgage and give him $20,000 cash. It wasn't much, but it was the best I could do. Jay looked at me like I'd saved his life. He turned to Aubrey, acting like everything was fine, as if they were still a couple. Aubrey wasn't having it. She reminded him that she'd only help him if he agreed to the divorce. Jay refused. He said he'd stall every legal attempt she made, leveraging his disability to make her look like the bad guy for leaving him while he was injured. Aubrey stormed out of the room, slamming the door. Jay turned to me, calling her worthless and claiming he'd rescued her from her rural Kansas life. He talked about her like she was an object he owned, not a person. Then he had the audacity to say how glad he was that we were friends again, talking about getting the old group back together. That was the final straw. I told him straight we weren't friends. We never would be again. He destroyed my marriage and stabbed me in the back in a way no friend ever should. I was done saving him, done with all of it. I left his hospital room and followed Aubrey out the door, leaving Jay behind in the wreckage he'd created. The days that followed were a blur. Aubrey started searching for a house for us, while I focused on wrapping up my divorce from Iris. At first, things seemed straightforward. We agreed on splitting everything down the middle. But her lawyer wasn't satisfied, pushing for alimony. I refused. I wasn't about to pay Iris for the mess she made of our marriage. Truth was, I didn't want any lingering financial ties to her. I had bigger plans and wasn't sharing my future success with the woman who betrayed me. Eventually, we settled. Assets were split 50-50ths, and I agreed to give Iris 40% of my 401k, but only when I retired or withdrew funds. That wasn't much, considering I planned to cash out the following week. Instead of monthly alimony, I handed her a lump sum of $24,000. It was clean and final. I moved half our savings into a new account under my name and cut her a check for $44,000, factoring in the equity from the house. Just like that, she was out of my life. Iris couldn't believe how fast I sold the house. She had no idea I'd lined up the deal long before we even started talking divorce. I'd struck a deal with Ryan Reynolds, a developer who rezoned the entire neighborhood for commercial use. The homes were torn down, and within 6 months, a luxury shopping center filled with overpriced designer stores stood where our neighborhood once was. My share of the profits was more than I ever dreamed. Within a year, I'd be a millionaire. Even after buying a house with Aubrey, yes, we were still together, happier than ever. Our future looked golden. Aubrey was everything Iris wasn't. Jay never showed her how good intimacy could be, but we discovered that together. She was passionate, adventurous, and insatiable. We spent hours exploring each other, and even now pregnant, she was just as eager. Fast forward to now, Jay had been trying to reach me for weeks. I ignored him until last week when I finally agreed to meet, partly for closure and partly for Aubrey's sake. He invited me to a barbecue, a sad attempt to revive old friendships. After 18 months, I figured it was time to see what he wanted. Aubrey kissed me before we left in my new 2012 Mustang. I adjusted the seat for her growing belly, punched Jay's address into the GPS, and we hit the road. She kissed me again as we drove. She does that a lot now. When we arrived, I was floored. Jay's new home was a beat-up trailer in a rundown park. I guess $20,000 doesn't stretch far. I left Aubrey in the car, wanting to break the news about us gently. I knocked on the door, expecting the sound of a wheelchair, but instead heard heavy footsteps. To my surprise, Iris opened the door. She looked nothing like the woman I once loved. Over 300 pounds, dull thinning hair, and curves that sagged beyond recognition. I had to fight back laughter. She gasped when she saw me, mistaking my smile for something it wasn't. She asked if I was there to take her back. Before I could respond, Jay's voice called from the side of the trailer. I turned to see him zipping around in a motorized chair, smug as ever. Iris lumbered after me as I walked over. Jay acted like he'd expected me all along, claiming the others were never real friends. Turns out, Bart and Christy divorced. Wally was still in prison, Deb remarried, and Aubrey had vanished from Jay's life. He couldn't track her down, and even her parents laughed when he called. I asked how he and Iris ended up living together. Iris claimed it was just for convenience. She'd burned through her divorce money and needed a place to stay, and Jay needed help. Jay, of course, called her out, still smug despite his situation. The idea of them together didn't faze me. He could have her. I'd left that chapter behind. Iris, trying to cling to any shred of hope, hinted she could still meet my needs. I laughed it off. Jay, meanwhile, eyed my Mustang, noting how good I looked, how rich I seemed, pointing out I was the only one from our neighborhood who came out ahead. I told him good things happen to good people. Then, Jay mused about how our neighborhood had turned into that fancy shopping center, how we all lost our homes just in time. He said it felt like something out of the Bible. He wanted to know what really happened. I could see the desperation in his eyes, and part of me wanted to spill everything, to tell him how Aubrey and I had orchestrated their downfall. But I wasn't stupid. Admitting the truth could land us in jail. I loved the life Aubrey and I built, and I wasn't about to risk it. So I held back. Instead, I smiled, turned around, and left them stewing in their misery. Aubrey was waiting in the car, and we drove off, leaving the past where it belonged. The final chapter of our tangled story unfolded when I visited Jay, carrying divorce papers for him to sign. I dangled a simple offer. Sign the documents, and he'd get $10,000. With no income and nowhere to turn, he hesitated, but eventually caved, knowing Aubrey was never coming back. Iris, clinging to old hopes, witnessed the signature, still trying to flirt her way back into my life. I brushed her off, pretending to head back to the car, knowing the real surprise was about to drop. When I returned with Aubrey, the shock on their faces was priceless. Both of them stared, speechless, as Aubrey rubbed her pregnant belly, flaunting the new life we'd built together. We revealed everything. Aubrey and I were deeply in love, expecting a child and planning to marry. She had finally experienced what true love and real passion felt like, something Jay had never given her. But the real blow came when I explained how their betrayals had fueled my revenge. Wally's house burning down, Bart and Christy's ruined marriage, Jay's foreclosure, all part of the plan. My partner bought up the properties, including Jay's and mine. We had the neighborhood rezoned for commercial use, and now Aubrey and I were minority owners of a thriving shopping center. We were wealthier than we ever imagined, with a future brighter than either Jay or Iris could fathom. Jay, dumbfounded, accused me of betrayal, claiming I was his best friend. But friendship hadn't stopped him from stabbing me in the back. He took what mattered most to me, and now he was left with nothing but a broken body and a crumbling trailer. Iris, devastated, sobbed on the floor, realizing too late the consequences of her actions. As we left, Jay and Iris tried to salvage some connection, but we were done. Aubrey and I had moved on. We'd turned their deceit into our victory, leaving them to wallow in the ruins of their own making. Occasionally, they still called, seeking apologies or help, but their pleas fell on deaf ears. Their world had collapsed, while ours flourished. In the end, the neighborhood had to disappear to erase the pain, and we were more than happy to watch it all crumble.